I learnt my history in apartheid South Africa. And obviously, being a white person, I was extraordinarily privileged in that society. I was in an all-white government school, and the only history outside of South Africa and the glories of apartheid, how we were bringing civilization to the world, was about the royal family in the United Kingdom. So when Mark and I started speaking, when I started looking into the events of 1842, it really has been an education for me. My son, when he was studying history, was fascinated by the 1848 revolts around Europe, which also took place in the UK very briefly. But even then, I find my history is a lot more current, I suppose, my understanding of the UK. And I realize in talking to Mark and reading around some of the history of these strikes, how incredibly important it is to understand this history of resistance, of the struggle for democracy, and how that struggle has always been and will always be an international struggle. And I think in that sense, there are some quite important things to glean from the South African struggle against apartheid. So I'm sure all of you know the system of apartheid was the world's first and most obvious system of legislated racism. And the way I try and describe it to people, especially younger people who have no conception of what apartheid was, is by saying that my wife, who was born in Bangladesh, would have been described as Asian in South Africa, where I was white. And then there were those who were not white or Asian who were described as Black African. And your rights were determined exclusively by how you were defined racially. So my wife and I in South Africa wouldn't have been able to be in a relationship together, wouldn't have been allowed to get married, and wouldn't even have been allowed to travel in a car alone together. Now, quite what they thought we would get up to traveling in a car says more about their lack of imagination than anything else. But this was the reality of apartheid. It determined every single aspect of your life. I had every privilege imaginable, simply by virtue of the color of my skin. I was even more fortunate, though, because growing up in a society of such racist inequality, I was fortunate that my mother was not South African. She was Austrian. And as a Jew, she survived the Second World War in occupied Vienna, one of very few Jews to do so. And she survived by being hidden in a coal cellar for 3.5 years. And when the Gestapo and the SS turned up in the working class district of Vienna that she lived in, she would be rolled up in a carpet, and the carpet would be placed against the wall, and coal would be packed around it. And she would tell me how she wasn't sure which was more terrifying, the fact that she could barely breathe from the coal dust, or the gunfire that she heard as soldiers tried to shoot out the lock to the steel door leading down to the cellar. Fortunately, they never managed to shoot the lock out. And I've taken my children to see this incredibly thick steel door that has the bullets embedded in it, where they attempted to shoot out the lock. My mother met my father, who was South African, in London after the war, and they went back to South Africa together. And when she arrived in South Africa, she quickly realized that people of color in South Africa were treated the same way that the Jews of Europe had been treated. And what she learned in the wake of the Holocaust was the notion of never again. And to her, like to most people, never again wasn't just about Jewish people. It was about all humanity. And so she got very involved in the struggle against apartheid. And from a very young age, from the age of 8 or 9, I would spend my school holidays illegally going into black townships and squatter settlements with her. So I grew up with a sense that there was something fundamentally wrong with the society in which I lived. And as I got more and more involved in township and squatter communities, I quickly began to realize that the ANC, the African National Congress of Nelson Mandela and Oliver Tambo and others, was seen by the vast majority of South Africans as their leaders, as their representatives. And so I got involved in the ANC struggle to end apartheid. And in 1994, when we had our first democratic election in our entire history, some people, especially internationally, thought, oh, well, that was fairly easy and went quite quickly. That wasn't the case at all. The ANC was founded in 1912. We won partial liberation in 1994. And I say partial liberation because while we won our national freedom, our freedom to live together regardless of race, the economic struggle in South Africa continues and is unsurprisingly racially defined. And when Mark was first telling me about the events of the 16th of August, 1842, it reminded me of an event just a few years ago in South Africa, where hundreds of striking miners at a place called Marikana occupied a hill because this was the place where they could show the country that they were not working and talk about the conditions under which they were expected to work for slave wages. At that time, South Africa's current president, a man by the name of Cyril Ramaphosa, who had been the General Secretary of the National Union of Mine Workers throughout our most militant decades, the late 70s and through the 80s. He, by this time a billionaire businessman, was on the board of the company that these miners were striking against. And because he had served in leadership positions within the ANC, he contacted the Minister of Mines and the Minister of Police, and he told them that within the next 24 hours, the strike had to be broken and the striking workers removed from the hill at Marikana. The next morning, mortuary vehicles arrived at the hill at Marikana, soon to be followed by heavily armed police personnel. The police started firing at the miners, killing 2 of them initially. The other miners turned and fled. Dozens of them were shot in the back. 3 miners were shot dead, found cowering behind rocks just behind the hill. It was the intention of our democratic state, our democratic police force, to end this strike and to punish the striking workers, to send a message to workers across our country. So the struggle for democracy in South Africa continues until this day. Just as the struggle in the United Kingdom for democracy continues until this day. As I stand here, there will be a number of people slaughtered in Gaza and in Lebanon. That is being done with weapons provided by the United States, Germany, and the United Kingdom. These weapons are made using our tax funds. They're exported in violation of British law and in violation of international law. But when it comes to national security, the law is not applied. At least 76% of people in this country wanted a ceasefire over a year ago and do not want British weapons being sold to Israel. Our politicians across the two main political parties don't give a damn what the vast majority of people in this country think. And our support for a genocide that is being live screened onto our devices every day has implications for us at home. In the last budget, the government voted an extra £3 billion for defense, unlimited amounts for the Ukraine, while cutting the winter fuel allowance, while scrapping the £2 cap on public transport, while refusing to scrap the two-child benefit policy. The cost of living crisis we experience today is directly related to the out-of-control spending on what our government claims is defense, but is as much the fighting of offensive wars around the world. So the conditions of the vast majority of people in this country today who are struggling is directly linked to the extortionate amounts that go into our defense budget. And of course, a significant amount of that money, because the arms trade is the most corrupt of all trades, accounting for 40% of all corruption in global trade. And some of that corruption finds its way into our political parties, to individual politicians. And this is at a time when Britain has more billionaires than we have ever had in our history, while at the same time more families are needing to use food banks than at any time since the Second World War. This simply cannot be correct in the sixth wealthiest country on the planet. But, and this is what is important, just like in 1842, just like in South Africa, we do not need to accept what our politicians have decided is the natural order of things. Because the reality today, like in the United States, like in much of Europe, is that we in Britain have the best democracy money can buy. But let's consider for a moment what it is that brought an end to over 340 years of racist oligarchy in South Africa. It was the extraordinary courage and resilience and bravery of millions of ordinary South Africans who, during the late 1980s, embarked on a wave of strikes across the country that effectively brought the economy to a standstill, made the townships ungovernable, so that entities of the apartheid state couldn't even enter those areas of the country anymore. And at the same time, tens of millions of people around the world supported that struggle through the boycott, divestment, and sanctions campaign against South Africa. I'm sure there are some of you who remember yourselves or your parents not buying the so-called outspan oranges, South Africa's export oranges, driving past the Shell station when the car needed filling up, because Shell supplied the oil to the apartheid security forces, closed accounts with Barclays Bank, or as students refused to open accounts with the banks. The moment at which Barclays decided to massively increase the cost of South Africa's foreign lending was the moment at which the game was up for the apartheid system, because the quality of life of us, the privileged white South Africans, started to decline. So I have had the enormous privilege and honor of being a part of a struggle that was successful. It is not complete, but it was successful. And the extraordinary thing is, despite that struggle being waged since 1912, the end of the system came incredibly quickly. In 1986, I had to leave South Africa at very short notice to avoid serving in the apartheid military. And the night before I left, I was up on a hill overlooking the city, and I thought that I would never again be able to set foot in the city and country of my birth. Because in 1986, there was no prospect of apartheid ending. The apartheid state was at its military zenith. The support from Britain, the United States, which had been largely covert, had become more and more overt. 4 years later, 4 years, the ANC was unbanned, our political prisoners were freed, and the exiles could return to our country. A further 4 years after that, Nelson Mandela was elected our first ever democratic president. So things can change incredibly quickly, even when we think they are particularly bleak. But it takes struggle, and it takes commitment, and it takes incredibly hard work from all of us. And there have been those who have been willing to make the ultimate sacrifice for political change in our societies. And we should never forget the words of Nelson Mandela, who after all spent 27 years in an apartheid prison. And when he was asked whether during those 27 years he ever thought change would come to South Africa, he said, "I knew it would. I knew it would." And he was asked, "But weren't there times when it felt impossible?" And he said, "Of course. But I've always believed, and I always will believe, that it is only impossible until we together do it." And that's what we need to do. Thank you very much.
before we finish, Catherine Howe, author of the wonderful book Halifax 1842, has brought a copy that she's signed and autographed for Andrew. I'd just like to ask or invite Catherine to present Andrew with her with the copy of her book. So, Catherine Howe, Andrew, thank you.
Thank you so much.